In less than 2 years, a heavily sanctioned nation quietly redrew the diplomatic map of West Africa. While Washington debated global crises, Iran signed refinery, mining, defense, and nuclear cooperation agreements with Burkina Faso, moving from visitor to strategic partner almost overnight. Under Ibrahim Traore, this outreach was framed not as ideology but as sovereignty, energy security, and technological self-reliance in a region long shaped by Western leverage. The deeper question is not why Iran arrived, but what this alignment signals about shifting power, sanctions resistance, and the future balance between Africa and the West. You are about to hear an explanation that many analysts understand but rarely state plainly, because it exposes how power actually moves behind official statements and diplomatic language. You will gain a clearer strategic lens on how alliances form, why they shift, and what signals usually appear before global balance changes. This is not casual background noise. If someone stops listening now, they might assume this is just another routine partnership announcement between distant countries. They could miss the deeper pattern already visible to policy observers who track influence rather than headlines. Without that perspective, future events may look sudden or surprising, even though they follow a trajectory that is already forming. Missing that trajectory means surrendering the advantage of understanding what is coming before it fully unfolds. What first looked like a routine diplomatic outreach is already being treated inside policy circles as a structural shift in alignment patterns. Analysts tracking resource corridors note that within roughly 24 months, Burkina Faso moved from limited contact to multi-sector agreements with Iran. A pace unusually fast for partnerships involving infrastructure, defense, and energy simultaneously. That speed alone is the first signal specialists flagged. The starting point traces back to a specific strategic need rather than ideology. Burkina Faso relies heavily on imported refined fuel, much of it routed through neighboring states and commercial networks historically tied to Western companies. Daily life runs normally. When they are disrupted, transport slows, electricity falters, and markets tighten within days. That vulnerability created a pressure point long before any foreign allegation arrived. The situation intensified after armed groups disrupted key transit routes, exposing how fragile external supply dependence could be. This was not theoretical risk, it translated into visible shortages, stalled businesses, and rising anxiety among urban and rural populations alike. The first people affected were ordinary consumers and small enterprises whose operations depended on stable fuel access. For them, geopolitics suddenly became practical reality. It was at that moment that Iranian proposals began to look less like distant diplomacy and more like a potential structural solution. Technical training and industrial cooperation designed to relocate part of the supply chain inside national borders. From a strategic standpoint, that shifts leverage. Control over refining means partial control over pricing, distribution timing, and crisis resilience. Observers say this is where Ibrahim Traoré's role becomes central to understanding the trajectory. His administration has consistently framed for partnerships through the lens of autonomy rather than alignment blocks. Whether one agrees with that approach or not, the pattern is clear: decisions are being evaluated primarily by how much domestic capacity they create. And that single criterion is what transformed an ordinary diplomatic visit into a development watched far beyond the region. As discussions accelerated, a central figure emerged not as a symbolic headline, but as a strategic navigator shaping how these agreements were interpreted inside and outside the country. Ibrahim Traoré was not presenting the partnership as ideological alignment with Tehran. Instead, he framed it as a recalibration of dependency structures that had long defined the Sahel's economic posture. Because perception often determines international reaction as much as policy substance. Early reactions from regional observers were cautious but attentive. Some African policy analysts noted that refinery construction inside Burkina Faso, even in a phased model, could reduce exposure to transit disruptions. Others focused on the training component reportedly embedded in the agreements, suggesting that technology transfer rather than mere equipment delivery was the intended model. But on building gradual internal capacity. A second early signal came from the pharmaceutical dimension of the cooperation. Burkina Faso imports much of its medicine, often at prices sensitive to currency fluctuations and supply chain volatility. Iranian firms, having operated for decades under sanctions, developed experience in domestic generic production. For health administrators seeking costs stability, that aspect of the partnership drew particular attention. These were not dramatic headline shifts. They were incremental but structural adjustments, observed quietly by economists and regional security planners alike. And from that point forward, the story stopped being about a visit or a summit. It became about whether a small West African state could meaningfully alter the architecture of its external dependencies. From there, the stakes moved to an entirely different level. Everything shifted fast. The sequence is traceable. January. A senior Iranian and diplomat lands in Ouagadougou. No ceremony focus, no symbolic tour. Meetings first, agreements discussed immediately. September arrives. A refinery promise appears, not a study. A commitment. Iranian engineers. Iranian technology. Iranian oversight, no Western contractors involved. That detail spreads quickly through diplomatic channels. October follows. 8 agreements signed, energy, pharmaceuticals, defense, multiple sectors at once. Multi-sector deals usually take years, this took months. Reaction begins, quiet at first. Regional officials ask questions, European desks request briefings, Washington analysts open new files. A year passes, September again. Another layer added, nuclear cooperation announced. Officially peaceful. Medical isotopes, agricultural applications, research. On paper, civilian, strategically sensitive. Western capitals react instantly. Monitoring increases, statements sharpen. Momentum continues. May. Tehran hosts the third Iran-Africa Economic Cooperation Summit. More than 700 African business figures attend. It is central. Delegations meet repeatedly. Trade targets expand. Long-term frameworks discussed. Meanwhile, conditions on the ground matter. Armed groups disrupt fuel corridors, transport slows. Lines lengthen, generators stop, businesses pause, pressure builds domestically. The vulnerability is visible. Supply dependence becomes tangible. Iran acts quickly, fuel shipments begin. Immediate deliveries, stopgap stabilization, markets respond, shortages ease slightly. Timing is noted. Assistance arrives during strain, not calm, that matters politically. Strategists map the pattern, offer infrastructure, provide supply, add training. Expand sectors, deepen ties, each step builds on the last. Ibrahim Traore reinforces the narrative internally, sovereignty, self-reliance, domestic capacity. Those words repeat in speeches and briefings. Supporters interpret the deals as leverage. Critics see risk. Attention intensifies. Internationally, reactions stack. France issues warnings. Analysts debate implications. Security forums add sessions. Think tanks publish assessments. Another development lands. Reports surface about drone cooperation discussions, not confirmed publicly in full detail. Security experts take note. Drones change battlefield math, especially in vast territories. Especially against dispersed insurgent groups. Economic channels widen too. Mining cooperation enters talks. Gold becomes relevant. Burkina Faso's production draws interest. Resource partnerships align with sanction-resistant trade models. Observers connect the dots. Then diplomacy escalates again. Burkina Faso reopens its embassy in Tehran. High-level visits resume. Security officials travel. Agricultural cooperation discussed. This occurs after sanctions tighten on Iran. The pattern now looks deliberate, not random, not symbolic, sequential, layered. Pressure increases externally. Sanctions enforcement expands. Hundreds of entities worldwide targeted for helping Iran bypass restrictions. Shipping networks monitored, secondary sanctions emphasized. Yet engagement continues. Meetings proceed. Agreements advance. Technical discussions deepen. Neither side signals retreat. Analysts watching the timeline reach the same conclusion. This is no single deal. It is a chain reaction. They rarely unwind quickly. The aftershocks are only beginning. Before examining projections, it is necessary to step back and look at the measurable scale. This is where emotion gives way to arithmetic. When numbers enter the frame, the weight of the situation becomes clearer. Start with resources. In 2025, Burkina Faso produced approximately 94 tons of gold, placing it among Africa's leading producers. Gold is not merely export revenue for countries under financial pressure. It functions as an alternative settlement instrument when traditional banking channels narrow. Now consider trade ambition. At the third Iran-Africa Economic Cooperation Summit, Tehran announced a target of increasing annual trade with Africa to $10 billion. That is not symbolic rhetoric. It reflects an intent to institutionalize commercial corridors beyond Western-dominated systems. The directional signal matters. Then there is the demographic dimension. And Niger together represent roughly 71 million people. A combined market of that size alters bargaining power. It means regional alignment is not a bilateral curiosity, it is a block dynamic with aggregate weight. The security variable adds another layer. Reports indicate that Iran has manufactured systems such as the Shade 136 and Mohair 6 drones at scale and relatively low cost. For a state combating insurgent groups across vast terrain, lower cost and systems can multiply surveillance reach without equivalent increases in personnel deployment. Now examine the sanctions environment. In 2025 alone, the United States sanctioned hundreds of entities accused of facilitating Iranian sanction evasion. Each designation restricts access to dollar-based clearing systems. For any company linked to sanctioned Iranian institutions, exposure risk expands quickly. Layer onto that the International Atomic Energy Agency vote in June 2025 declaring Iran non-compliant with nuclear obligations. 19 countries voted in favor. 3 opposed, including Burkina Faso. That diplomatic positioning placed Ouagadougou publicly on one side of a high-stakes global dispute. Finally, consider the military escalation that followed. 12 days of coordinated air strikes targeted Iranian nuclear facilities. Infrastructure damage was significant. Sanctions were reimposed through a snapback mechanism soon after. Asset freezes, arms embargoes, restrictions tightened again. Individually, each number is manageable. Together, they describe a high-pressure environment, a gold producer aligning with a sanctioned nuclear state. A regional bloc forming amid expanding sanctions. Trade ambitions colliding with financial restrictions. This is not abstract geopolitics, it is a measurable intersection of resources, markets, sanctions, and security. The question is whether those variables stabilize or compound. Different observers interpret this alignment in sharply different ways, and serious analysis requires presenting those perspectives at their strongest before weighing them. And understanding them clarifies why the situation draws such sustained international attention. One position holds that partnerships like this represent rational diversification. From that view, countries such as Burkina Faso are not rejecting existing partners, they are reducing single-source dependence. Supporters of this argument point out that infrastructure offers, technology transfer, and industrial training can strengthen domestic capacity. Ibrahim Traoré's strategy resembles economic hedging, building multiple channels so that no external actor can exert decisive leverage. They argue that states long constrained by condition, allayed, or restrictive financing naturally seek alternatives when new options appear. Cooperation with sanctioned nations is not defiance, it is risk distribution. Critics, however, present a different calculation. They argue that partnerships with heavily sanctioned states carry hidden long-term costs. Financial isolation can spread through secondary sanctions, affecting banks, trade routes, and investment access. Even if immediate penalties are limited, future growth could narrow if international financial institutions or multinational firms hesitate to engage. From this perspective, what looks like sovereignty today could become structural constraint tomorrow, especially if global payment systems remain dominated by Western institutions. Supporters respond that this concern assumes the current financial architecture will remain unchanged. They note that alternative trade networks are already forming among countries facing restrictions, creating parallel channels outside traditional systems. If those networks expand, early participants might gain first-mover advantages rather than suffer exclusion. Placed side by side, both arguments reveal something important. The disagreement is not really about one agreement or one country, and which side of that transformation will ultimately hold more leverage. A detail that initially seemed secondary has started to change how analysts interpret the entire sequence. The partnership is not centered only on finished products or immediate supply. What is drawing attention now is the reported emphasis on technical transfer and local training embedded inside several cooperation areas. That distinction matters because it separates transcation allayed from capacity-building arrangements. If external contractors simply deliver equipment, dependence continues. If engineers train local teams, dependence gradually declines. Observers reviewing the agreements note that Iranian specialists working alongside Burkina staffs suggests the second model is at least part of the design. It implies the goal may not be short-term relief, but long-term internalisation of skills. This is where Ibrahim Traore enters the picture as a decisive variable. His public framing has consistently stressed autonomy measured by what a country can produce domestically rather than what it can import reliably. If that principle is applied consistently across sectors energy, medicine, mining, security, the trajectory changes from partnership to structural transformation. From this point forward, the story is no longer just about cooperation agreements. It becomes a test case. If capacity actually transfers, other states will study the model. The narrative collapses into another example of unfulfilled promises. Either outcome will be watched closely far beyond West Africa. And what comes next determines which interpretation proves correct. What follows is where consequences move from strategy papers into daily reality. Decisions that once existed only in diplomatic rooms begin to show up in budgets, markets, and household expectations. Then increasingly visible as each sector absorbs the impact. For state institutions, the immediate effect is pressure to manage a more complex foreign policy balance. Aligning with a sanctioned partner while still engaging global institutions requires careful sequencing of decisions. Officials must weigh infrastructure gains against financial exposure, especially as international compliance rules tighten. Administrative systems that once handled straightforward trade relationships now have to monitor sanction risks, banking pathways, and procurement channels simultaneously. Governance becomes more technical, more demanding, and less forgiving of miscalculation. Businesses encounter a different set of realities. Companies involved in energy distribution, mining logistics, or industrial supply chains must adapt to new partners, new standards, and sometimes new currencies or payment routes. Opportunities may expand where Iranian cooperation introduces equipment or expertise. Yet, uncertainty also rises if foreign banks hesitate to process transactions linked to sanctioned entities. For commercial operators, profit potential and operational risk begin to rise together rather than separately. Ordinary citizens often feel the effects most concretely. Medicine prices, electricity stability, and employment prospects are the variables that shape public perception. If refinery construction or pharmaceutical production succeeds, households could cease steadier supply and lower costs. If delays occur, expectations may outpace delivery, creating frustration. Public confidence tends to follow results rather than announcements. Beyond national borders, regional and international actors monitor closely. Neighboring governments evaluate whether similar partnerships might strengthen their own bargaining power. Western policymakers analyze whether sanction frameworks remain effective. Other sanctioned countries watch for proof that parallel cooperation networks can function in practice. Each group interprets developments through its own strategic lens. Taken together, these layers reveal a simple truth. The consequences are no longer theoretical. They are already spreading across institutions, markets, and societies, and none of the stakeholders can fully step outside their reach. Looking ahead, three plausible pathways emerge, each grounded in current signals rather than speculation. The base scenario is steady but cautious continuation. Agreements move forward incrementally. Infrastructure projects advance slowly but visibly. Sanctions pressure remains present yet manageable, with limited enforcement spillover. In this path, Burkina Faso diversifies without fully severing Western engagement. Maintaining a delicate balance between alternative partnerships and existing financial channels, the pace is gradual. The impact is measurable but not disruptive. An optimistic scenario depends on delivery. If refinery construction progresses on schedule, pharmaceutical facilities become operational, and technical training yields genuine domestic capacity, then sovereignty gains become tangible. Improved fuel resilience and localized production could strengthen economic stability. Under that outcome, Ibrahim Traoré's strategy would be viewed as pragmatic diversification rather than risky defiance. And other states might replicate elements of the model. The worst-case scenario unfolds if sanctions intensify or enforcement expands aggressively. Secondary restrictions could complicate banking access, slow investment inflows, and constrain export markets. Infrastructure delays would amplify skepticism, and promised benefits might fail to materialize quickly enough to offset financial strain. Economic friction could outweigh strategic autonomy. The decisive factor across all three scenarios is implementation. Agreements on paper are politically powerful, but execution determines long-term outcomes. Monitoring timelines, project milestones, and financial flows will reveal which trajectory gains momentum. Strategic patience may prove as important as diplomatic boldness in shaping what ultimately happens next. After understanding the broader landscape and the possible paths ahead, the most important question becomes personal. What does a geopolitical shift like this actually mean for someone watching from afar, following events, trying to make sense of them before they fully unfold? The answer depends on how closely one chooses to observe and interpret signals while they are still forming. Those who actively track global developments already hold an advantage. They notice patterns early, compare sources, and recognize when small events signal larger structural movement. For them, cases like this are not isolated stories but reference points that sharpen analytical instincts. Staying informed helps them anticipate change rather than react to it. Others may not follow international affairs closely yet still feel indirect effects. Migration trends and security dynamics can all ripple outward from decisions made far away. And maintaining awareness of global trends can reduce surprise when distant events suddenly influence local realities. There is also a third group: people who assume such developments have no relevance to their lives. Ignoring shifts in global power structures often means recognizing their impact only after consequences become unavoidable. Awareness does not require obsession, but it does require attention, whichever group someone belongs to. Understanding transformations like this ensures they are not caught off guard by the direction the world may be moving. Awareness is not alarmism. Earlier, a regional policy observer described watching a quiet meeting room where technical advisors reviewed infrastructure diagrams rather than political talking points. No cameras, no speeches. Just engineers, charts, and timelines. That image captures the essence of what has unfolded since. Because the real story was never only about announcements. It was about the machinery behind them. From that quiet beginning to the present, the journey has moved through agreements, reactions, scrutiny, and speculation. Listeners who followed step by step have seen how a single diplomatic opening evolved into a test of economic models, sanction resilience, and strategic autonomy. The path has not been linear, but it has been deliberate enough to trace. In that sense, the narrative is larger than any one country or partnership. It reflects a wider question about how nations navigate pressure, opportunity, and constraint at the same time. Ibrahim Traoré has become one of the figures associated with that question, not simply because of decisions made, but because those decisions are now being studied as indicators of a broader shift. What remains is not just analysis, but meaning. Events like these remind observers that global change rarely announces itself loudly at first, gathers momentum, and only later reveals its scale. History turns before headlines notice. Moments like this tend to linger after the facts are understood. because each listener draws a different conclusion from the same sequence of events. Some hear a story about strategy or opportunity. That variety of interpretation is part of what makes conversations about global change meaningful rather than uniform. If this perspective felt worth your time, it may also be worth passing along to someone who prefers context over headlines and depth over noise. Sharing ideas is how awareness expands, and awareness is often the first step toward clearer thinking about a complex world. Thoughtful discussions rarely begin with certainty, they begin with curiosity. So the real question now is simple. When you look at shifts like this one, what do you think matters most, the alliances themselves or the direction they suggest the world is heading?